This is House Planning Help episode 73. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you want to learn what it takes to create a high-performance home or how you might renovate an existing property. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century, and my personal goal alongside this is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up in this session, my guest is Richard Oxley from Oxley Conservation. We're looking at how alterations to period properties affect performance. Welcome along, whether you're a regular or perhaps new to this podcast. This is just my research, my opportunities to go and chat to various different people, and I absolutely love this. I'm learning so much. Been doing this for about 2 years, and long may it continue. Although I'd quite like my build to advance a bit more, and we're going to update you in just a few moments. I wanted to tell you what we're doing right after the interview today. I want to give you more details about the membership area of House Planning Help that I'm developing and exactly why I'm doing that now. However, the stage I'm at is plot finding. We're starting to get a bit more serious, although it is tricky. I think that's what I've discovered so far, that there are plots out there, although they're not where you would like them. And I mentioned this before, how I'd like to cobble together a couple of plots, although I'm struggling with that. But we are going out on our first few viewings, more or less to get a feel of what is on the market. And there's this very odd moment where you're searching for land, you think, oh, this is really good value, and then you discover actually it's only there for agricultural purposes or putting a horse on or whatever it might be. So you've got to keep your eyes open for that. The other funny thing that I've found is when people seem to advertise these plots but with a house that's already designed on it, which I find a little bit strange. But I found a few of these and I don't quite understand whether you can just say, well, actually I don't want to put that building up on it, or whether you have to go with what they want, and this is just a way of an architect or a builder getting that particular project developed. So that's where we're at. Another approach that I'm trying to just going all sorts of different ways to try and get a plot that's a reasonable value, because that's the tough thing, particularly if you're near to a city. I imagine you're going to struggle with this too, but approaching some architect friends that I've actually made and using them to keep an ear to the ground, and perhaps they're already doing developments, so maybe there's a plot of land that they're developing that I could go alongside. Let's get to today's interview, and it's with Richard Oxley from Oxley Conservation. It's been a while since we talked about period homes and how you can make them more energy efficient, so we're back on the case today, and Richard has loads of experience, examples to share as well, so we'll get stuck in. I started by asking Richard to share a bit about his background.
I started off as a chartered surveyor who was interested in old buildings, and from there that interest developed into actually studying for RICS diploma in building conservation, and from there I went to work with a historic building contractor locally for a couple of years, and then decided to branch out in 1997 to form my own consultancy, and been working here ever since.
I think I should mention as well that we're in a beautiful part of the UK, Henley upon Thames, which I think gives you extra kudos in this realm that we're talking about today. So we've called this episode How Alterations to Period Properties Affect Performance. And I think what I'd like to do, although this might be quite basic, but before we get going on it, is to just define a few of these terms. For example, what are we classing as an alteration?
If we're talking about improvements for, say, energy efficiency, it could be secondary glazing, putting insulation in a roof space, insulating walls either internally or externally or under floors, and there's many other things that could affect the overall performance of the building. So any alteration is something that could make a change to how that building is used or performs.
Before we got chatting here, you were actually telling me about there's something very different between traditional and historic, those two things, which to me, I suppose I might group together. So what are we talking about when we think about period properties?
Well, a period property is most likely to be traditional, and some of them will be historic in terms of, are they protected? So perhaps putting a greater cultural importance on some of the buildings that are protected rather than just traditional. But irrespective of whether they're protected or not, is how do the buildings perform? And most period properties are constructed with the ability to what's called breathe, so that is be vapor permeable. so the movement of moisture in and out of the building.
Performance, we talked about this a lot in terms of thermal performance. Are we interested in other aspects of performance too when we're looking at historic and traditional buildings?
There's many degrees of performance, so we're looking at how the building can cope with weather, climate. Its orientation will affect its performance in terms of how walls dry out, how the building's used, how much water vapour is produced within a building, the number of people using it, how many times they cook or bathe. So performance is very complicated, but it can be simplified into understanding what areas are under pressure. So in terms of, say, a kitchen or a bathroom, they would be areas of potentially high risk where you'd probably need more consideration in terms of the volumes of water vapour being produced.
Starting on a project, what is the first thing that we look at? I'm assuming it's understanding the building.
Correct. It's the fundamental principle, because without understanding the building, you will not know how to respond to that building, what's important about that building. So if it's a historic building that is formally protected, or even if it's unprotected, what's important culturally and of significance, what's an important feature? And actually making an alteration, you could lose what you liked about the building in the first place. So standing back and perhaps looking and understanding your building, how it's constructed, how did it perform? Perhaps its performance has been changed by previous owners using the wrong materials, causing problems of damp or other problems. So it's important to understand the building, put together those jigsaw pieces of why you want the building and where you want it to go.
Does it matter who the occupant is in a building? Presumably over time that has changed, but does how they live actually affect the building?
It has a massive impact, because you can have people, say, an elderly person with less needs and requirements, bathing less, cooking less, and has a simple lifestyle compared to a full-on family where there's constant cooking and constant bathing and use of hot water. So there's a great range within how buildings are used, from low intensity to high intensity, and also which parts of the buildings are used more. If you've got a big house, you may actually find that parts of the building, like attic spaces or individual rooms, may not be used very much. So perhaps you need to look at how those buildings are used and treat them differently from the rest of the building.
When we're thinking about making an alteration, most people will come into this wanting an addition, an extension, or with an idea in mind. So once we've understood the building, what should be the next steps in how we go about this?
Well, once you've understood the building and understand how it performs, what works are required to repair the building and put it in good order first, because a lot of people jump into actually coming to a preconceived idea of what they want to do with the building. And really, you've got to understand, is the building, the existing building, going to be in good condition? Are we going to spend money in actually getting it with a good roof, making sure there's good rainwater management? Because currently in the UK we're suffering from extremes of weather where we have large deluges of rainfall. Can the rainwater disposal system cope with that? Are we making sure that it's got good boots so that, water is going away from the foot of the building, making sure we're starting with a good foundation? Then we look at the alterations and say, right, how is that compatible with what we've got? How are we intending to use it? Because we could, if we haven't lived there perhaps for 6 months, 9 months, a year or more, it may take you a couple of years to get to know a building, is how can we make improvements that actually are beneficial and not a preconceived idea? Because sometimes you think you know the building, and it's not until you've lived in it that you can actually come up with a firm idea of, well, I wish we'd done that, which is what you want to avoid. It's like, oh, we made the right decision.
How often are you undoing work then? It did sound in that response there that there are occasions where you just want to rewind before you go forwards.
A lot of our work is actually undoing work. No one intentionally goes to damage a building. And a lot of the works we do are well-intentioned repairs or alterations, mainly starting from the Victorian period onwards, where Modern materials have been used in past repairs, such as cement-based renders and pointings, and these cause long-term damage to traditional buildings that rely on the movement of moisture and equilibrium in the walls to prevent deterioration of the masonry, so brickwork or stonework, or decay of timbers. So we find that we're trying to reinstate what was the intended performance, and there's good guidance on this. The Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings has got a lot of information about the need for old buildings to breathe, which is a very good technical pamphlet. And these help you understand the basic requirements of understanding old buildings. So when you come to an old building, what are we trying to do? Do we need to reinstate the traditional performance? Is it causing a problem? One elevation may be exposed to the prevailing elements, and there's been a history of failed attempts to address that exposure and actually cause more problems than it's tried to solve. So you may have to think, right, we need to change that building, and it may be external cladding to protect it rather than using cement renders and such like. It may be actually providing a physical barrier. So there's lots of different ways of getting to understand how a building performs, and undoing works may be necessary.
I'm not sure that I fully understand the intended performance and how this changes. So over time, when they started out, let's say they were building 300 years ago, what did they want in terms of performance, and how has that changed now out of what we might want, and where do the two meet in the middle?
Okay, well, when they were building these buildings, they used the materials available, and there's a small selection of materials that were available, and there's only things like flint or granite that are really impervious, and most of the other materials like lime or earth, which were used as the mortars and plasters, they're vapor permeable and allow moisture in and out. And as we've developed, and the development of things like cement, OPC, ordinary Portland cement and such like, the ability of moisture to move in and out of the fabric has been reduced, and this causes problems for these older buildings. And the big danger of making alterations for the period properties now is that with insulation materials in particular, we could be introducing impervious barriers such as vapor checks and such like, where they're actually changing how the building performs and concealing problems that could build up and result in decay, damp patches, mold growth and such like. So it's about understanding the materials. Are they compatible with how the building was originally constructed or altered before the introduction of more modern materials? That's not to say all modern materials are bad. We're reinventing the wheel with lime and also using more earth plasters. So there are modern materials available that you can introduce that are not in conflict with the existing building.
I think what I find interesting about the work that you do is that you really are on a sliding scale of almost dealing with ruins right up to some high performance upgrades. So I'm interested, maybe you could tell me or give me a few examples of some different projects that you've looked after, and we'll include some photos in the show notes, and how you've improved them, and perhaps finishing on woolly furs.
Okay, well, we look at a lot of things, from reducing drafts is a simple one, and looking at perhaps things like secondary glazing, and also using diagnostic tools of saying, right, where are the problems? And a good one is an air pressure test, and not being having preconceived ideas of what the problems are, because what we find is that some older buildings actually perform better than modern buildings, especially sort of 1960s, 70s buildings, which have very poor performance in terms of thermal performance and also in terms of drafts. So air infiltration is an issue, and how you solve that. So blocking up, really big gaping holes in your building, you can help that improve it. And we've done that on a National Trust building, a cottage, and making sure that was done. The most effective improvements in terms of perhaps going for the big one is when taking the opportunity of perhaps when a roof is stripped, in need of stripping, and that is when you can introduce a really well detailed insulation system, because trying to do it with the roof coverings on is a compromise most of the time, and it's very difficult to detail. So if there is an opportunity when you own a building to say, right, we need to build an extension, we need to alter it, or there may have been a fire, or you're reacting to some sort of event, then that's the time to think, can we make an improvement in the thermal performance of the building, because you can actually get to the building and get the detailing right. For example, at Woolly Firs, which was a redundant farm building, an agricultural building, and it was owned by a local wildlife trust, and they wanted to convert it into an education centre. So we did a full retrofit. So that was insulating the roof with a warm roof where the insulation goes over the rafters, and also the internal wall insulation. And we selected the materials to be as compatible as possible with the traditional breathing performance, and that was using wood fibre insulation and using lime plasters internally. And we also put in an underfloor heating system and looked at using limecrete and other things like that. So we chose the materials carefully, and it was monitored afterwards by UCL, University College London. They found that the performance was acceptable and that actually the walls were not at risk of causing serious problems of damp and decay. So it was working in the right way. And there's other benefits of using things like wood fibre, because it adds thermal mass to roof structures, so you don't get heat gain. And it's also good with sound. It's less tinny inside, so it helps deaden sound, especially if it's an education centre and you've got lots of children in there. So it's how the building's used, how it performs, and getting all these compatible bits to go together. So it's a complicated jigsaw.
With Woolly Firs, I know that because it had some of this research carried out, that you could compare and contrast between the north and south facades. So maybe you could tell me what you discovered through doing that.
Yes, the research was interesting because before people were doing research like this on performance, a lot of this was a gut feel for how these buildings performed. And the research showed that the south elevation was more subject to warming and cooling and the effect of the sun, whereas the north is a more constant condition. And the performance was quite interesting in the sense that it illustrates that the aspect of a building, north, south, east, west, does affect how you insulate it, perhaps approach it and protect it from the elements. So if you've got prevailing winds from the southwest, say, perhaps you have to look at how that is protected so that the wall can actually perform and be kept warm in a way. Understanding the building, again, this is another thing about understanding the building. We're on a steep learning curve, and there's a lot of research now starting in this field which will help us understand how to make good, effective improvements. And if we're going to alter a building, I think one of the main messages we've got to take hold of is to say, if you're going to make an improvement, make it an effective improvement so that it is actually beneficial to you as the user, but also that it has real gains in terms of energy loss or reduction rather, so that we're not just spending money to tick a box that we've actually done it. Let's make it a real improvement that benefits the building. And again, I think you as the user and the environment, I think it's looking at those three elements, making sure that everyone wins in all those three terms.
Under what circumstances can things go wrong? And if you have any examples of other things that you've seen, maybe these are projects that you've had to deal with.
I think the things that you see go wrong are down to fundamental basic practices, which is things like maintenance and repair. So not looking after your rainwater goods, making sure rainwater gets away from the building.
Is moisture the big one? Because I do hear that mentioned a lot, and moisture can, once it gets into a building, it's trouble. Yes,
and in particular, if there's been introduction of materials that inhibit the evaporation of moisture. So once moisture gets in, it can't get out, so it sits there. And if moisture is there for a long time and timber's in contact with the wall, are subjected to prolonged levels of damp, they will be subject to decay, so fungal decay or insect attack. So really, controlling moisture is fundamental. So a lot of these systems, you've got to be careful to make sure that if water can get in, it can get out again. And a lot of the materials that are compatible with historic buildings will allow wicking of moisture away from problems. So you're not concentrating moisture problems, where the use of modern materials that aren't vapor permeable or impervious will help concentrate moisture, and that can result in actual serious problems to the building. So really, damp is a big problem, but really only if you haven't looked at the risks of timbers in those areas. Are there timbers at high risk? If there are, then how do we manage that risk? So really, it's trying to make the building continue its original performance, so it keeps the ability of moisture to escape if it ever gets into the building.
In my mind, I have this picture of a building that might have had 5 or 6 different alterations. And when you were doing your analysis of it, how do you tell which bit is providing the poor performance? Because you're not looking at a whole image. So how do you identify those specific parts of the building? Or is it as simple as just thinking, that's a wet wall there?
Old buildings develop organically, and there's usually a reason why they put on an alteration. It could have been to show off. It could be to protect the building from the elements, or part of the building from the elements. So it's trying to understand why alterations were made is a good start. How it was constructed, and is it in good condition? Does anything need to be done? And then perhaps looking at saying, well, in terms of its performance, what am I asking it to do? Is it working okay as it is? Because we seem to be insulating to stop a lot of heat loss. And really, perhaps what we should be doing is to stop heat gain. And if you've got a big, thick stone wall, is that a characteristic that you want to maintain? Because it will help with the cooling of the building in the future. So having to look at what is a building and what you're asking it to do. And an air pressure test is a good way of finding where problems are in terms of heat loss and drafts. So a lot of heat can be lost just through the movement of air through a building. So if you can do that, it can be relatively effective. Perhaps 30% has been known to improve the thermal efficiency just by good, considered, well-detailed draft proofing. So understanding the building is paramount in everything we do. So its history, how it's used, and how it has been used, and the intention of use as well, because that will dictate what improvements are expected, or you're trying to achieve a standard. And perhaps standards is something that we've got to be wary of, because a target for a modern building may not be appropriate for an older building, and there's dangers with imposing arbitrary standards on very individual buildings, because that can actually lead to conflict. And what we're trying to do is manage change. So we're trying to manage change in the best way for the building, at the use, and of course the reason we're doing this, to reduce the impact on the environment. So again, it's trying to have a holistic viewpoint and trying to balance that in all those 3 areas.
Air tightness testing, you mentioned that a few moments ago. I'm intrigued as to what you can do. How will it change the air tightness, or just some buildings that might be naturally airtight to begin with? What have you seen? Well,
one case we did for the National Trust, we found that over 30% of the heat loss was actually through the roof. And so by doing an air pressure test and looking at that, we used it as a diagnostic tool to where we concentrated resources. So there was some energy loss through the walls and windows, but where we could make the biggest impact was on the roof. And the reason for that was because there was a need to repair the roof structure, which had decayed because of water penetration. And then once we repaired the roof frame, we could then insulate the roof and reclad it with tiles, and it was fit to go. And by doing that, we targeted an area that was in need of repair, but where we could maximise the performance of the building, and air pressure testing helped us identify that.
Is there any such thing as an improvement that actually you've wasted your money, or you've chosen poorly of how you've added to a building?
I think a lot of these examples are probably with hindsight, and I know from my own extension that we constructed, which was in inverted commas, an eco extension. The floor, the timber floor, was ventilated, and although we put insulation in between the floor joists, I think it sagged with time, and I should go back and improve it. And we'll find that we will learn from our mistakes. We have to share our experiences so that everyone can learn. And I think that we will see some nightmares where things go wrong, but I think it's important that things like the research is continued so that we get a better scientific understanding, more informed decisions can be made, and that way we can make sure that our improvements are better and more effective and do what we intend them to do.
Are there any other key points to this whole process that we should bring in here?
I think that the fundamental thing is to understand your building, understand how it was constructed, what materials were used, what materials have been used in past repairs and alterations. Are they compatible? Are there conflicts in the performance? Are there problems as a result of alterations? What works do you need to do to get the building to a good condition before you start altering it is, I think, a good idea, because you can spend a lot of time and effort adding an improvement to a building when you actually need to put your resources in an existing problem. And then understanding how you're going to use it. Is it a good way of using that building, and perhaps getting to know the building before making big improvements? So I think those are the fundamental things, is understand your building and understand what you want from it, and is it achievable, and is it going to be compatible, or is it going to be in conflict with that building?
Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can find the show notes for this session at houseplanninghelp.com/73. We've summarised the main points, got photos of some of the projects we've been talking about, and we have links to Richard at Oxley Conservation. One announcement, and this is actually more news on the membership area of House Planning Help that I'm developing. Even in the very early days of House Planning Help, which is a couple of years ago, it was an idea at the back of my mind. I don't think I was quite ready to do it then, and I certainly didn't have the value that I wanted to be able to provide on the inside. So I've been biding my time, and I think the time is right. Although I'm hugely busy, what is great now is I've got more resources to be able to go and cover this so that it doesn't have to include my time, or perhaps a couple of visits, but not massively. So here is the vision of what I'm trying to do. This membership area has to have huge value, or else what is the point in doing it? And I've received a lot of benefit from going around to various projects, either when they're completed and seeing the finished buildings, hearing from the owners of the properties how the journey has been, or actually getting there when it's a building site. So I've had a lot of insights through doing that. And really, that's what I'm trying to build up in this membership area. This could work on quite a big scale. I'm hugely ambitious, and I think that at some stage in the future, we could be showcasing projects from around the world. I'm not going to jump too far ahead, so let's just start with one project. And this will be with Alex Baines. We're just sorting out the final details. His build, Long Barrow, is soon to be underway down a beautiful part of the UK in Gloucestershire. So I've been on site, and we'll have a video to show you of what that plot looks like. It's a patch of grass at the moment. The idea being that we will break that down into various different videos so that you can actually see exactly what is going on there. You don't have to be doing it in real time, of course, because that would take forever. Seeing that build process, hearing interviews. The trouble with video is it's quite expensive, which is why I have to do this. I have to put a paid element of House Planning Help so that if we can do that, then I can reinvest in more content. And I think that's what will create the value if I can just keep on growing it and growing it. So it will start small. It will probably hit me in terms of cost to begin with, but I really believe that this can work. So the founder members will be really important to shaping this community. We'll obviously try to bring in the experts and have as much as possible going on so that you feel you're getting benefit. And I really would like to price it so that it's incredibly accessible for anyone, perhaps more on a yearly fee than it will be on a monthly fee. So I'm very, very excited about this. There will be lots more about our membership area coming up soon. I suppose we ought to get a name for it. I'll have to put that on my to-do list. Just a quick call to action, and that is to subscribe to our email newsletter. We've got lots of helpful tips on there and resources from our experts. houseplanninghelp.com/subscribe. So next time we meet Alex Baines, and we're going to get an overview of his project, all the work that's gone into getting it up to the build. So I hope you can join me for that one. Cheers.